I am delighted to be here. I want to talk more concretely about particular strategies that the public sector could take to encourage and facilitate automated driving. Now, the assumption is there that automated driving is a good thing, and that can be talked about in question, but on the assumption that we do want to facilitate some kinds of safe automated transportation, I'd like to share some strategies that we can discuss and debate. Before I do that, though, I want to commend the organizers of this conference for connecting the dots, for realizing that we need to embrace all of these issues in a holistic way. To go back to our themes from this morning, who's familiar with the Jetsons? A little bit of, all right, I'm not the only thing from America here. All right, Jetsons, 1960s show set in 2062. I hate the Jetsons. Here's why. This is a futuristic society where we have presumably flying cars. Nonetheless, as we see from this episode, the cars still have steering wheels, and it's still appropriate, funny even, to dedicate an entire 20-minute episode to the premise that women are bad drivers. We've gone forward 100 years, and yet we still have steering wheels and sexism. That is the Jetsons fallacy. Do not do the Jetsons fallacy. Do not take the one issue that we are interested in, be it automated vehicles or housing or energy, extrapolate that into the future, but leave everything else about our existing world fixed. In fact, as we saw this morning, everything is going to change. Not just technologies, but values, norms, and legal institutions. So to bring that home to the question of automated driving, imagine for a minute that you wake up one morning and you realize that your razor is about a continent away. I might be speaking from some personal experience here. What are you going to do to get a new razor? Well, you could get in your own self-driving car and drive that to the store and pick up a new one. You might take a robo-taxi, a fleet of automated vehicles that you don't own. We're counting on Yannick Augustin and his team at Eindhoven to bring this to us. You might take that fleet to the store and pick up a razor. You might have it delivered to you by a small shuttle operating on sidewalks. It might come to you by drone. Or you might simply go to your 3D printer and print yourself off a new one. Likewise, as today, you might walk or you might bike. This is just a partial selection of the realm of possibilities that we're talking about. We're not talking about today's cars stuck in the future with a computer at the driving wheel. We're talking about many more possibilities and technologies. Specifically, if you want to put that in fancy engineering charts, there are a couple of ways that engineers have tried to approach this question of automation. One is through the respective roles of the human driver on one hand and the computer system on the other. You do not have to read all of these words. It's from one particularly successful taxonomy of automation. But it refers to what things the human does. Is the human paying attention? Is the human gripping the steering wheel? Is the human intervening occasionally? Or are they sitting back waiting to be asked to resume actively driving? Or are they doing nothing at all, perhaps sleeping in the back as the vehicle is driving every way? This is the traditional view of automation, an incremental approach where computers just do more and more and more until eventually we have the fully self-driving car. Now, there's also another way to look at this, because the leap from high automation, where a computer is driving part of the time, to full automation, where a computer is driving all of the time, is actually really, really difficult. So we may see this happen by different geographic areas, over different roadway types, or traffic conditions, or weather conditions, sne, or events and incidents. So perhaps a vehicle will start off in a small business campus, university campus, and as the technologies get better, it will expand into more and more areas, perhaps more roads, perhaps nighttime conditions. Then it will start in another community, and then perhaps it will start driving between the communities. And while the vehicle is doing nothing more, the environments in which it is operating are expanding. So these are the two different visions of how we might see automation. They're stylized. One is conventional vehicles where the computer just takes over more and more of the driving task. The second is we start with a fully driverless vehicle that nonetheless is very limited in scope, limited in geography, and as the capabilities expand, it expands its domain of operation. I make this distinction because it's important when we start talking about the legal and policy strategies we may use to realize these vehicles. One is focused on large markets, the kind that automotive companies are familiar with, the kinds that consumers are familiar with. The other is focused on local conditions, local needs. Let me start with the first category, driver assist and large markets. So these strategies realize that we're necessarily talking about economies of scale, about large production of large markets, and ways of calibrating law to facilitate and incentivize that kind of deployment. The first strategy is to ensure that our infrastructures are clear and consistent. I use infrastructure broadly. We're not just talking physical infrastructure, streets, lane markings, signals, but much more broadly, the legal infrastructure, the digital infrastructure, maps, and others. Roads are a mess, even within Europe where things are standardized, even with an individual state in the US where things are supposed to be standardized. We nonetheless have different norms, different signals. This will be more difficult for automated vehicles to fully adapt to and understand. Likewise, the rash of legislation we've seen within the United States and are starting to see more internationally is creating inconsistency that could impede some of the automated operations. So providing clarity on one hand, but also providing consistency across jurisdiction could be very useful. The second strategy is to internalize the costs of driving. Now, if automated vehicles represent a significant safety improvement, and that is still an if, then they will be most attractive if people have to pay for the full cost of their crashes today. If insurance prices truly reflect all of the costs of collisions in society. Likewise, if automated vehicles represent an efficiency improvement on a per kilometer basis, also an if, then the more that people have to pay for the true costs of their driving in fuel taxes and other fees, then the more attractive automated vehicles will be. If we internalize those costs, then a system that is more efficient will be cheaper and will be more attractive. Next, enforce existing law. So often there's this sense in media or popular discourse that automated vehicles will somehow be boring. Well, yes, they'll be good, but who will drive them if we want to be the ones driving our car and racing on the streets? Oh, so much that humans do today is already unsafe, whether it's failing to maintain their vehicles, modifying their vehicles, speeding, drinking, to the extent that human drivers have to follow the law, cannot speed, cannot do crazy things with their cars. Automated vehicles will seem more attractive in comparison. These seem simple, and yet these are the kind of concrete steps that could actually start changing some of the dynamics and demands for these systems. Likewise, insurance will necessarily play a large role in addressing, checking, and compensating some of the risks of automated driving. Insurance is based on data. So to the extent that insurers are able to get data about vehicles, to understand how drivers behave today, to understand how automated vehicles are likely to change road traffic conditions in the future, the better they will be able to anticipate and price risks. They will take a hump of adoption that might look like this and help smooth it so that it's easier to get over. Now, that also requires some flexibility for insurers. So strategies like usage-based pricing, where you pay for the risk that you as a driver or passenger are imposing or incurring at a specific moment in time because of traffic conditions, because of snow or weather, or your own ability to drive. Having insurers be able to take those into account can likewise allow them to identify instances where automated driving is a safety improvement and therefore should be even cheaper than human driving. So those were my 4 strategies for driver assistance, the traditional notion of vehicle automation. Ensure clarity in our infrastructure, internalize the costs of our driving, enforce our existing laws, and rationalize our insurance systems. What if we move to a more local approach? Strategies for driverless systems, the kind of cars that really have no identifiable human driver, will start out small, but could expand to more communities, more areas, more environments. Well, here I give you a bonus one. We actually have 5 strategies. The first is to start local, to identify the particular local needs and opportunities that exist. Is there a downtown, a central business district that would be ideal for a slow-speed circulating shuttle? Is there a business campus, a university, a large airport parking lot? What are the particular transportation needs that a community has, and in what way might a customized automation solution help address those? And then, once we've identified needs and opportunities, what resources are there that could be deployed in the interest of automation? Are there dedicated managed lanes that might be allocated to vehicles? Are there parking fees that might be used to discourage parking or encourage shared solutions? Are there traffic signals where vehicle-to-infrastructure communications might make sense? Business districts where communication would be difficult unless amplified or assisted by infrastructure-based systems? Are there taxi cab concessions that might be used strategically? New York City, a few years ago, awarded a concession for a taxi cab of tomorrow that was anything but tomorrow. It was not futuristic, it was a minivan. But imagine if that concession, which was valued upwards of $1 billion US, had been used to incentivize the kind of advanced driver assistance systems or novel shuttles that might be possible. That's real money. So these are resources that communities can deploy. Communities likewise control their local infrastructure. So are there some local cost-effective solutions that could be imposed? Better digital mapping of construction sites, of traffic conditions that could be useful to these systems. Again, managed lanes, vehicle-to-infrastructure technologies, signal systems. This kind of preparation could provide a springboard for local solutions. And how will non-conventional vehicles and services fit into this picture? A lot of the legislation we've seen in the US and efforts elsewhere tend to assume that automated vehicles will look like today's cars, will quack like today's trucks. Well, that's likely not the case, at least not universally. How should existing traffic laws apply to low-speed vehicles that might not have the same safety profile as today's very heavy vehicles? Personal mobility solutions, like we saw with the Segway a decade and a half ago. It was a difficult legislative battle then. It would be likewise difficult for someone with a novel automated vehicle concept to get that kind of legal clarity as quickly as they may need. It's not just vehicles, it's services too. Whether Uber or Lyft, ride-sharing, car-sharing services, these have faced significant legal uncertainty, clarity, and in some cases outright prohibition. And yet they are the kinds of solutions that could work very well with the non-conventional automated vehicles, the robo-taxis, the shuttles, the local systems. And a key with these kind of non-conventional systems, with our local markets, is to embrace flexibility. That means not waiting for all of international law to change to arguably accommodate the driverless car, but having creativity to find pilot solutions, to find ways of working within existing legal frameworks, to give public authorities the flexibility and the resources they need to work cooperatively with the private sector to pursue site-specific changes. That's why I was so excited to hear Secretary Comps refer to the equivalence principle, the idea that there are other ways to do things, and giving the public and private sector the flexibility to realize that could be instrumental in these kinds of concepts that will challenge how we conceive of cars, of self-driving cars, and mobility more generally. So those were my strategies for driverless systems. Think locally, identify needs, opportunities, and resources. Prepare our physical and our digital infrastructure. Clarify the status of non-conventional vehicles and services, and fundamentally embrace flexibility. And when we're doing this, there's a tendency to focus only on the automated vehicle and ignore the status quo, a status quo that is unacceptable in terms of its impact on people, on the environment, on communities. At a first note, human drivers are in some ways very impressive today. We, in the European Union, drive some 5 trillion kilometers, 5,000 billion kilometers driven annually. Huge number. And so what is a tragic death toll, 30,000 direct deaths annually, plus roughly 50,000 through pollution, a number that is often ignored, seems really high, but on a per kilometer basis is also fairly low. So automated vehicles have a lot of low-hanging fruit, but also a lot of real challenges. Over 5 trillion kilometers, automated vehicles are going to cause casualties. They are going to cause crashes. They are going to kill people. And yet, can we reduce the 30,000 or the 80,000 fatalities that we have, or the 1.3 million direct injuries in the European Union every year? Understand the risks that automated vehicles pose, but also appreciate the risks that the status quo imposes, and that the status quo is not acceptable. And so when we're doing this, we have to expect more from all motor vehicles and their drivers, not just automated vehicles, not just the developers of automated vehicles, but today's vehicles and today's drivers. There was one of the earliest bills in the United States was introduced in our capital territory in DC, and it was really a dream of progressive legislation. It was a vehicle miles traveled tax. There was a requirement for electric vehicles to be used in automated vehicles, all sorts of generally good policies, and yet they were imposed only on automated vehicles, and they ignored the conventional vehicles that will still, for decades, account for a majority of our vehicle fleets. This was not passed in that form, in part because of concerns that automated vehicles are being unfairly targeted. And that's our challenge, how to address the status quo and the potential that we're facing. I've talked about a number of public sector strategies. These are developed in a little more detail in a book chapter called Regulation and the Risk of Inaction, that is not to minimize the important role that the private sector plays in any of these questions. And I have another paper that addresses that, proximity-driven liability. They are both available at Law of the Newly Possible. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll look forward to an afternoon of good discussion.